Imagine your alarm goes off,
Oh, no.
right? It's Monday morning,
Yeah.
you hit snooze.
Naturally.
You're just dreading the inbox, the meetings, that endless to-do list stretching out before you.
The standard start to the week for most of us, yeah.
Exactly. And you've probably been told your whole life that this grind, this relentless dedication to your job is a fundamental moral virtue.
Hard work builds character.
Idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Yeah.
We have an entire cultural vocabulary dedicated to glorifying exhaustion.
We really do.
But there is this compelling argument, and this is what we're getting into today, that everything we've been taught about the inherent virtue of hard work is actually a trap.
A trap, yeah.
Like a meticulously constructed historical illusion designed specifically to keep the masses exhausted and compliant.
It completely flips the script on how we're conditioned to view productivity. And what makes this critique so potent, I think, is that it isn't some new, trendy anti-work philosophy born out of, recent post-pandemic workplace frustrations.
Like this isn't from a TikTok video.
Exactly. We are actually talking about an intellectual framework that is nearly a century old, yet it feels as though it was written specifically about our modern, hyper-connected lives today.
So today, for you, the listener, we are doing a deep dive into the ideas of the British philosopher, logician, and social critic Bertrand Russell.
Specifically unpacking the Wikipedia entry on his 1935 essay collection.
Right, in praise of idleness and other essays. And his thesis is just as radical today as it was back then.
Absolutely.
He basically argues that the belief that labor is virtuous is causing immense societal evil. Work is by no means one of the primary purposes of human life.
It's quite a statement.
And the true road to human happiness, and societal prosperity for that matter, is a massive structural reduction in the amount of labor we do.
To really grasp the weight of this, we have to situate Russell in his time. It's 1935.
The Great Depression.
Yeah. The world is sandwiched between two devastating global conflicts and mired in the worst economic depression in modern history. The prevailing economic anxieties were centered around pure scarcity.
Just sheer survival for a lot of people.
Exactly. So in that environment, to publish an essay titled In Praise of Idleness was inherently provocative.
Almost offensive to some, probably.
For sure. But Russell, who was an aristocrat by birth, but a deep skeptic of elite institutions by nature, he saw a structural absurdity in how human beings valued economic productivity at the direct expense of human well-being.
He recognized that the industrial machinery meant to liberate humanity was instead being used to subjugate it further.
Yeah, that's the core tragedy he's pointing out.
And before we get into the mechanics of his argument, we should probably throw out a quick disclaimer here.
Good idea.
Because Russell spares absolutely no one in his critique. Both left-wing and right-wing systems get scrutinized.
He takes aim at everyone who champions this relentless gospel of work.
Right. And just to be clear to you listening, we're impartially reporting on these politically charged viewpoints strictly as they appear in the source material. We're not taking sides or endorsing his views. We're just exploring the sociology and philosophy he laid out.
Yeah, we are strictly the messengers here, because he dissects the hypocrisies of capitalist landowners who profit off the labor of others.
While preaching the value of a hard day's work, of course.
But then he's equally critical of the Soviet regime of the 1930s. He calls out their authoritarian demand for endless labor under the guise of the worker's paradise.
Which demonstrates how deeply embedded this obsession with endless toil is within the human psyche.
It's a systemic critique. Russell is identifying a psychological pathogen that infects entirely opposed political ideologies.
Right, regardless of the overarching economic system.
Whether the factory is owned by a corporate baron or by the state, the worker on the assembly line is still being ground into dust.
And they're still being told that this grinding process is their highest moral calling.
Exactly.
So if endless toil is the pathogen, what is Russell's prescription? Because he doesn't just offer a vague complaint about work.
No, he proposes a very specific mathematical solution.
He argues that if labor were equitably shared out among everyone capable of working, unemployment would plummet and human happiness would skyrocket.
And his magic number for this?
A 4-hour workday.
4 hours!
Can you imagine?
It sounds utopian, especially given that today we still struggle to normalize a 40-hour week without people checking their emails at midnight.
Oh, totally. But Russell's 4-hour figure wasn't just pulled out of thin air.
He argues that 4 hours of daily labor, distributed evenly across the adult population, should be entirely sufficient to entitle every person to the necessities and elementary comforts of life.
But how does he justify that mathematically? Especially in 1935, if you suddenly cut global production hours in half,
Yeah.
wouldn't conventional economics suggest that you'd crash the economy and plunge everyone into poverty?
Well, conventional economics assumes an efficient distribution of labor,
Right.
which Russell observed was a complete myth. Think about the reality of his time and ours, really. You have a society where some people are working 12 to 14-hour days.
To the point of absolute physical and mental collapse.
Yeah. And simultaneously, you have a massive segment of the population that is entirely unemployed
Desperate for wages.
and producing nothing because the system won't allow them to participate. Russell points out that this is an incredibly irrational way to organize a civilization.
It's a massive misallocation of human energy.
Exactly.
If you take all the necessary work required to keep society functioning, growing the food, building the houses, generating the power, and divide it evenly among every capable adult, the sheer math simply doesn't require us to labor from dawn until dusk.
The bottleneck isn't a lack of work to be done.
It's the artificial concentration of that work.
Right. And the ripple effect of correcting this imbalance, according to Russell, would be transformative on a civilizational scale.
Tell me about the ripple effect.
Well, first, unemployment is practically eradicated because the existing work is spread out.
Makes sense.
Secondly, the massive influx of leisure time for the average citizen changes the entire psychological landscape of society.
Because when people are not utterly drained of their physical and cognitive resources
Yeah.
by the mere act of surviving the week,
They suddenly have the surplus energy required to innovate. Russell predicts this would result in an unprecedented boom in the arts and sciences.
so I want you, the listener, to just imagine for a second what you would do with a guaranteed 4-hour workday.
What would you do?
Would you learn a language? Would you start a garden? Or would you just stare at the wall?
That's a huge question, and it sets up a crucial distinction Russell makes about leisure later on.
But before we get to that, we have to look at the fact that innovation wouldn't just be the domain of a wealthy few anymore.
Or those lucky enough to secure a rare academic grant.
It would be accessible to the many, because the many would finally have the time and energy to participate. Just imagine the sheer volume of human potential that's currently trapped inside people who are too exhausted to think after a 10-hour shift.
We lose countless brilliant minds to exhaustion every single generation. Russell is asking us to consider what a society looks like when its citizens actually have the time to be citizens.
So if a 4-hour workday is mathematically possible and societally beneficial, why aren't we doing it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why does the mere suggestion of working less often trigger a visceral defensive reaction, even from the workers themselves?
It's conditioning.
Yeah. This brings us to Russell's first major argument, which is essentially the unmasking of a historical time job.
He argues that the overwhelming value we place on hard work is nothing more than a moral prejudice created and maintained by the privileged classes.
The con of duty. Let me read the specific quote from the source here because it's explosive. He writes, "The conception of duty, speaking historically, has been a means used by the holders of power to induce others to live for the interests of their masters rather than for their own."
That is a staggering reframing of morality.
It really is. We are taught that doing our duty, showing up early, staying late, giving 110% to the company, is a reflection of our internal character.
And Russell is saying, no, it is a reflection of your conditioning.
Let's break down the psychology of this power dynamic, because it's central to understanding why we feel guilty when we rest.
Right. If you look at the historical progression throughout human history, if a small group of people wants to live in luxury without having to do the grueling, back-breaking physical labor required to sustain that luxury,
They fundamentally need a large group of people to do that labor for them.
Exactly. You need farmers, builders, miners, weavers.
But you cannot rely solely on physical force or the threat of violence to keep those laborers working indefinitely.
Now, a purely coercive system is inefficient. It requires constant policing, and it's perpetually prone to rebellion.
So what do they do?
To create a stable, multi-generational system of exploitation, you need a psychological tool. You need the laborers to police themselves.
You need them to believe that working themselves to the bone is inherently noble. You attach their sense of self-worth to their productivity.
Precisely. You create a moral imperative. You make hard work synonymous with goodness, and you make idleness synonymous with depravity and sin.
The ruling classes effectively preach that the absence of structured activity will lead the poorer classes straight into moral decay.
By framing relentless toil as a spiritual and moral safeguard, exploitation is rebranded as salvation. It is framed as being in the worker's own best interest to be exploited.
It is an insidious psychological trick. But Russell makes a really nuanced point here about the psychology of the elite. He points out that the ruling classes don't necessarily sit around in dimly lit rooms, consciously plotting to deceive the working class.
Right, they aren't cartoon villains.
No, he argues that the holders of power conceal this fact from themselves by managing to believe that their interests are identical with the larger interests of humanity.
That cognitive dissonance is crucial. No one wants to view themselves as the villain in their own story.
So how do they justify it?
To resolve the discomfort of living in luxury while others starve in the fields, the privileged class convinces themselves that their wealth and their leisure are actually beneficial for the entire societal structure.
They adopt the mindset of, we are the stewards of high culture. We are the architects of progress. We are the job creators.
Exactly. They conflate their personal comfort with the progress of civilization.
And once they internalize that belief, they can sleep soundly at night while preaching the absolute, unyielding necessity of toil to the working class.
They view themselves not as exploiters, but as the necessary pinnacle of a functioning society.
Which brings us to a historical paradox that Russell uses to illustrate this point: the Athenian slave owners.
This is a great example.
When we think of ancient Athens, we think of the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, mathematics, theater. We revere these permanent contributions to civilization.
But those contributions were only possible because the philosophers and thinkers of Athens were not spending 12 hours a day farming or moving stones.
They had abundant leisure time.
And that leisure time was entirely subsidized by a brutal, comprehensive system of slavery.
Now, obviously, Russell is not defending slavery.
No, not at all.
He's making a cold, structural observation about what is actually required to build a civilization. He argues that leisure is the essential ingredient.
In antiquity, producing the basic necessities of life took immense amounts of manual labor. Because technology was primitive, the only way to carve out enough free time for a small segment of the population to study geometry or debate ethics was through the absolute subjugating labor of the many.
Right. So the labor of the slaves wasn't valuable because work is an intrinsic moral good.
The labor was valuable solely because of the leisure it afforded the masters. The end goal, the truly valuable output that generated culture and progress, was the leisure.
That completely inverts how we usually think about it.
It does.
The historical necessity of exploiting a massive underclass to produce a sliver of leisure for a ruling class was a tragic reality of the ancient world. But Russell's point is that the moral framework used to justify that system.
The idea that the underclass has a divine or moral duty to labor tirelessly.
Exactly. That framework survived long after the economic and technological necessity vanished.
We kept the psychological software of a slave society, even as we upgraded our physical hardware.
And Russell specifically targets the surviving beneficiaries of this outdated system, particularly wealthy landowners.
He delivers a devastating critique of rent-seeking behavior here.
According to the text, he points out that through the sheer arbitrary ownership of land, these individuals are able to make others pay for the privilege of simply being allowed to exist and to work on that land.
It is the ultimate form of passive income, built on the active exhaustion of others.
He notes that historically, from the dawn of civilization right up until the Industrial Revolution, a farmer could generally produce just a tiny bit more than was required for his family's bare subsistence.
But that tiny surplus wasn't left to the family who produced it.
No, it was skimmed off the top by warriors, by priests, and eventually by landowners.
And the bitter irony that Russell highlights is that these landowners, who appropriate the surplus labor of the working class, are themselves utterly idle.
Their comfortable existence is entirely dependent on the relentless industry of others.
Yet historically, they are the loudest champions of the gospel of work.
They preach the moral necessity of hard work to the poor, while fiercely guarding their own right to remain completely idle. They champion a lifestyle for the masses that they would never, under any circumstances, accept for themselves.
Understanding this historical context is vital, because it allows you to recognize that the guilt you feel when you are not being productive.
That nagging voice in your head on a Sunday afternoon telling you that you should be doing something useful.
That isn't necessarily a natural human instinct. It is a manufactured, inherited prejudice. It was designed centuries ago by those who stood to benefit most from our ancestors' unquestioning compliance.
Okay, so that establishes the historical con of duty. But Russell doesn't just rely on ancient history. His second major argument is grounded in the reality of the modern era, specifically the sheer power of technology.
He argues that modern technique, particularly industrial mass production, is already sufficient to provide for the needs of all human beings with a minimum of labor.
We don't need the brutal, unequal systems of the past because we have machines that can do the heavy lifting.
Russell is writing this with the hindsight of the Industrial Revolution and the technological leaps of the early 20th century. But he doesn't just speak in theoretical terms about what machines could do.
Right, he points to a very specific, undeniable historical event to prove his point: the radical rationalization of wartime production during the First World War.
This is one of the most fascinating logical deductions in his entire essay.
Think about the logistics of a global war. During World War I, a massive portion of the working population was suddenly completely removed from their normal, productive jobs.
You had millions of men drafted into the armed forces, effectively removing them from the domestic labor pool.
Then you had millions more shifted into munitions manufacturing, building tanks, producing war propaganda, working in espionage.
None of these fields produce the basic necessities of human life. They don't grow food, they don't weave clothing, they don't build civilian housing.
So you have a society where an enormous percentage of the workforce is actively diverted away from keeping the population alive.
Logically, you would expect a massive collapse in the standard of living on the home front. You would expect starvation and total systemic failure.
And yet, that didn't happen.
Not at all.
The source notes that Russell points out that the rationalization of wartime production, the centralized organization of resources and machinery, showed that a very small number of people could successfully produce the necessities of life for the entire population.
In fact, he notes that the general level of physical well-being among the unskilled wage earners on the side of the Allies was actually higher during the war than it had been in peacetime.
It's a profound proof of concept.
Truly.
If a fraction of the population, utilizing modern industrial techniques, can sustain the entire country, feed the armies, and build the munitions during a massive, resource-draining global conflict,
Then surely if we simply shared the necessary work fairly during peacetime, individuals wouldn't need to work much at all to produce life's essentials.
the war demonstrated the sheer, terrifying, productive capacity of modern machinery when it's organized efficiently.
It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the technological barrier to a life of leisure had been solved. We had the tools to eradicate grueling, endless labor.
But the tragedy is what happened when the armistice was signed.
Yeah.
When the war ended, we didn't keep those streamlined production methods and distribute the massive surplus of time back to the people.
We didn't say, great, the machines are so efficient that everyone only needs to work 4 hours a day now.
Society immediately reverted to the old, grueling model.
Because the goal of the prevailing economic system is not the maximization of human leisure. It is the maximization of profit.
We built machines specifically to save time and reduce human toil. But instead of diminishing the amount of labor required of the individual worker, we simply produced more commodities.
It is the paradox of the tractor.
Explain that.
We invent a mechanized tractor that can plow a field in half the time it took with a horse. The logical outcome should be that the farmer gets to go home at noon and rest.
Right.
Instead, the economic system demands that the farmer use the tractor to plow twice as much land in the same amount of time, doubling the yield to sell on the market, while remaining just as exhausted as before.
We kept the working hours exactly as long. We kept the workers exactly as depleted.
Russell argues that the ruling classes, the owners of the modern technique, actively chose to maintain the social control of a tired workforce rather than distribute the newly discovered leisure time justly.
The technological barrier to a 4-hour workday is gone. It's been gone for a century. The only barriers that remain are psychological and structural.
Which brings us to a very practical question.
Let's say we manage to tear down those structural barriers. Let's say society collectively agrees to implement a 4-hour workday tomorrow.
The immediate counter-argument, usually from those in power, is that if you give the average person too much free time, society will collapse into depravity.
People won't know what to do with themselves. They'll just drink, gamble, and rot away.
Russell anticipates this deeply cynical view of human nature. He is very clear that a reduction in working hours does not mean that the remaining 20 hours of the day should be spent in pure frivolity or passive decay.
He argues that 4 hours of work a day should entitle a person to the necessities and comforts of life, and that the rest of their time should be theirs to use as they see fit.
But he draws a massive distinction in how we use that time. This brings us to his concept of leisure, which is vastly different from how we define time off today.
When we talk about leisure today, we usually mean recovery.
We mean crashing on the couch after a brutal week.
But Russell's conception of leisure is rooted in classical philosophy. It is very similar to the Latin concept of odium.
Otium, praised by Roman philosophers like Seneca.
It's a fascinating concept. In ancient Rome, odium was the defining characteristic of a free citizen.
As opposed to negotium, which literally translates to not leisure, meaning business or daily affairs.
Odium wasn't about taking a nap or staring blankly at a wall.
Right. Otium is deeply active, culturally enriching leisure. It is time dedicated deliberately to personal growth, intellectual exploration, the arts, civic duty, philosophical debate, and the cultivation of the self.
It's the specific time when you are acting as a fully realized human being, rather than functioning merely as an instrument of labor or an economic input.
But when Russell looks at the modern urban population of the 1930s, and this applies tenfold to us today, he doesn't see people engaging in otium.
He sees people engaging in what he calls passive pleasures. He points to people spending their time watching cinemas, watching football matches, listening to the radio.
If you were writing today, that list would be binge-watching streaming services, endlessly scrolling algorithmic social media feeds, or passively watching someone else play a video game online.
And it is crucial to understand that Russell isn't judging the working class for this passivity. He isn't being an elitist scold telling people to turn off the radio and read Plato.
He diagnoses the root cause of this passivity. Why are our pleasures so passive?
Because our active energies are entirely consumed by our jobs.
If you've been working an 8, 10, or 12-hour shift, commuting for another hour, and stressing about your inbox the whole time, your body and your mind are utterly depleted.
You simply do not have the cognitive or physical surplus required to engage in active, enriching leisure.
You can't come home from a grueling shift and immediately start writing a symphony or building furniture or engaging in deep civic debate.
You are forced to choose passive entertainment simply to recuperate enough baseline energy to wake up and go back to work the next day.
The notion of leisure has been reduced to a biological necessity, simple recuperation of the body, rather than an opportunity to discover new life experiences.
We are literally too tired to live our actual lives.
The tragedy is that we mistake this exhaustion-induced passivity for our natural state. We think, oh, I'm just a lazy person who likes to watch TV.
No, you are a depleted person functioning exactly as the system requires.
Exactly.
So how does Russell propose we elevate ourselves from this passive recuperation back to active otium? If we implement the 4-hour day, how do we relearn how to be active participants in our own lives?
He argues it requires a fundamental shift in how we approach education.
Liberated education.
In his proposed social system, education must be carried much further than it currently is. And crucially, the aim of this extended education cannot simply be vocational training.
Which is largely what education is today, right? We teach people how to be better, more efficient workers. We train them for the labor market.
Russell argues that education must aim at providing the tastes which would enable a person to use their leisure intelligently.
Cultivating tastes.
It should expose people to a wide variety of pursuits, allowing them to discover what genuinely engages their active energies.
And again, he isn't just talking about highbrow pursuits like reading classical literature or studying quantum physics. He uses a very earthy, grounded example from the text that I love: peasant dances.
He notes that traditional peasant dances, which required immense physical energy, coordination, and community participation, had largely died out except in deeply remote rural areas.
But he insists that the fundamental human impulses, which caused those dances to be cultivated in the first place, must still exist within our nature.
We still possess the inherent desire to create, to move our bodies, to participate in communal rituals, to make music together.
That human impulse hasn't vanished. It has just been smothered by the sheer weight of industrial exhaustion.
If people actually had more leisure time and weren't physically destroyed by their jobs, they would once again enjoy pleasures in which they took an active part.
We would stop just watching the screen and start participating in the world again.
Think about the hobbies people take up when they finally retire or when they're on an extended vacation.
Woodworking, painting, community gardening.
Joining a local sports league, amateur astronomy. That is the modern equivalent of the peasant dance.
That is active leisure. That is the otium that a 4-hour workday would unlock for the entire population. not just the wealthy or the retired.
It is a beautiful vision.
But Russell doesn't just limit his critique to the factory floor or the corporate office. He turns his critical lens toward other institutions that perpetuate this flawed system, starting with his own professional backyard, academia.
This is where Russell's self-awareness really shines. He was deeply entrenched in the academic world, yet he offers a severe critique of what we would call the university bubble.
He highlights the profound confinement of intellectuals within their own isolated spheres.
He observes that university life is so incredibly insulated from the realities of the world at large, that academics tend to be completely unaware of the preoccupations, the struggles, and the daily grind of ordinary men and women.
You have brilliant minds sitting in ivory towers, theorizing about the nature of society, but they don't actually interact with the society they are analyzing.
Furthermore, he critiques the very language that academics use to communicate.
He argues that their ways of expressing themselves, the dense, impenetrable jargon that characterizes so much academic writing, actively robs their opinions of the influence they ought to have upon the general public.
If you are writing a brilliant systemic critique of modern labor, but you write it in a dialect that only 5 other tenured professors can decipher, you aren't actually helping civilization.
You're just participating in an exclusive intellectual country club.
And he goes even further, critiquing the bureaucratic structure of the universities themselves.
Highly organized academic studies.
He argues they actively discourage truly original research. If you're a thinker who wants to pursue an unutilitarian pursuit, something completely out of the box, something that doesn't immediately guarantee a profitable outcome or fit neatly into a departmental grant application, the rigid hierarchical organization of academic institutions will likely shut you down.
He bluntly concludes that academic institutions, as they are currently structured, are not adequate guardians of the interests of civilization.
Why? Because the academics are too isolated and rigidly organized, and everyone outside their walls is too exhausted from relentless labor to engage in unutilitarian pursuits.
It is a massive systemic failure to foster true intellectual and cultural growth across the board.
And it's vital to remember that Russell isn't just picking on capitalism or Western academia. As we touched on earlier, his critique of the Soviet regime of the 1930s is equally scathing.
Right. And again, reminding the listener, we are neutrally reporting his historical critiques here. Examining this impartially as Russell presented it, he saw the Soviet experiment not as liberation of the worker, but as the ultimate terrifying manifestation of the gospel of work.
He criticizes the regime for adopting an authoritarian dogma of work. He notes their intense cult of efficiency.
The ideology claimed to serve the proletariat, but the practical reality was a system that demanded absolute, relentless productivity from every citizen, punishing idleness as a crime against the state.
The moral prejudice of duty simply wore a different political mask. In the West, you worked endlessly to enrich the capitalist landowner. In the East, you worked endlessly to fulfill the quotas of the state.
In both systems, the fundamental value of the human being was reduced to their capacity for labor. It proves how deeply ingrained the pathology of overwork is in the modern human condition.
Russell also intertwines his critique of work with his stance on pacifism and his active ridicule of politics in the essay collection.
He viewed the hyper-competitive, aggressive nature of international politics as fundamentally absurd. Politicians were constantly driving nations toward catastrophic conflicts, which he vehemently opposed, while completely ignoring the simple structural solutions that could alleviate daily human suffering.
Solutions like the fair, equitable distribution of labor and leisure.
Okay, we have explored the deep historical context of 1935, the philosophy of odium, the sociological critique of duty, and the failure of institutions. But here's where this deep dive bridges the gap between a century-old essay and the very real anxieties you might be feeling at your desk right now.
The enduring legacy of Russell's thought is most visible in our modern workplace vocabulary.
Based on the terminology and related topics section of the Wikipedia article, we are seeing a massive cultural reckoning with the exact issues Russell raised.
We're inventing new language to describe the symptoms of a disease he diagnosed 90 years ago.
Let's do a rapid-fire analytical discussion of these modern terms. Let's look at the modern rejection of the gospel of work.
Okay.
Russell said the moral prejudice of duty was a historical con job. Today, millions of workers are waking up to that con and they're reacting. Take the phenomenon of quiet quitting.
Quiet quitting is perfectly aligned with Russell's philosophy. It is not actually about quitting your job. It is the conscious decision to reject the moral imperative to go above and beyond.
It's refusing to let your job consume your identity. You do exactly what you're contracted to do, exactly what you are paid for, and no more.
It is a psychological boundary against the creeping demand for endless, unpaid emotional and temporal labor.
We also see more disruptive rejections, like loud quitting or the massive social movement in China known as Tang Ping, which translates to lying flat.
Tang Ping is a fascinating manifestation of Russell's exact critique. In China, you have the 996 working hour system working from 9:00 a.m. to 9:00 p.m. 6 days a week. It is the absolute zenith of the cult of efficiency.
In response, an entire generation of young people is actively rejecting societal pressures to overwork, buy property, and overachieve.
They are choosing a low-desire, minimalist lifestyle. They are literally lying flat in the face of the industrial machine. It is a direct rejection of the historically mandated conception of duty.
We even have terms like bare minimum Monday, which is the practice of setting strict boundaries right at the start of the week to preserve your active energies.
All of these trends represent a workforce that has intuitively realized what Russell explicitly stated. The holders of power have induced us to live for the interests of our masters rather than for our own.
And people are finally saying, no, I am going to preserve some energy for my own odium.
But these movements are born out of desperation. What happens when people don't reject the gospel of work? What happens when they internalize it completely?
We see the grim consequences of ignoring Russell's warning in terms like occupational burnout.
Burnout isn't just being tired. It is the complete psychological, emotional, and physical exhaustion that occurs when we ignore the human necessity of a 4-hour workday and push human beings beyond their sustainable biological limits for years on end.
And the darkest logical conclusion of this is the Japanese term karoshi, which literally translates to death by overwork.
People suffering fatal heart attacks or strokes purely due to the stress and physical toll of endless, unrelenting corporate labor.
It's the ultimate, tragic fulfillment of the belief in the absolute virtue of labor working until the biological machine completely fails. This is exactly the great evil Russell warned about.
We also see the psychological toll in everyday terms like the Sunday scaries.
That creeping dread that sets in on a Sunday afternoon, anticipating the sheer exhaustion of the coming week. It ruins the tiny sliver of leisure we are actually granted.
And then there is the infinite workday, brought on by smartphones and remote work, where the boundaries of labor bleed into every waking hour. You're answering emails from bed. The concept of pure, uninterrupted leisure is completely obliterated.
This brings us to a really vital connection regarding Russell's point about wartime production. Remember his mathematical deduction.
That a small fraction of people utilizing modern technology can produce all the necessities of life for everyone.
If that was true in 1918, and our technology is exponentially more advanced today, what are the rest of us actually doing in our 8, 10, or 12-hour days?
This is where we get the concept of bullshit jobs.
If industrial and agricultural production is sufficient to provide for everyone with minimal labor, then logically a massive portion of modern administrative and corporate jobs must be entirely unnecessary for the actual functioning of society.
They exist primarily to keep people busy. They maintain the structural illusion of the 40-hour week, and they enforce the moral prejudice that everyone must be seen to be working, lest they fall into depravity.
We've created massive corporate bureaucracies that generate work for the sake of work.
And when you are trapped in one of those jobs, you engage in productivity theater.
Productivity theater is the act of trying to look busy at work, even when you have completed your actual tasks. Because the corporate culture demands the appearance of relentless toil, you can't just say, I'm done for the day, I'm going home.
You have to sit at your desk, staring intently at a spreadsheet, waiting for the clock to hit 5:0 p.m.
Or the modern remote work equivalent, buying a device that physically jiggles your computer mouse so your status stays green while you go do your laundry.
It is absurd. We are engaging in theatrical performances designed to appease the ancient, inherited gospel of work.
We also see coffee badging, showing up to the corporate office just long enough to swipe your security badge, grab coffee, and prove you were physically present before going home to actually get your work done in peace.
These behaviors highlight the deep structural friction between the technological reality we live in and the psychological conditioning we are subjected to. We know the work doesn't take 40 hours. The employers often know the work doesn't take 40 hours, but neither side can break the cultural spell.
However, there are evolving structures that are actively trying to implement Russell's vision. We are seeing real-world discussions and pilot programs mapping onto this. like the 4-day work week and the 6-hour day.
These aren't just utopian thought experiments anymore. They are empirical attempts to prove what Russell argued mathematically in 1935, that reducing hours does not destroy productivity.
In many of these trials, productivity actually remains stable or increases, while employee well-being, health, and happiness skyrocket.
And the ultimate horizon of this line of thinking is the concept of a post-work society.
A theoretical future where automation, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence finally allow us to completely sever the link between grueling human labor and basic survival.
A society where the necessary work is handled by machines and the resulting surplus of time, the true wealth of a civilization, is distributed justly as leisure.
When you synthesize all of this, the profound realization is that we are still fighting the exact same battle Bertrand Russell identified nearly a century ago.
The terminology has evolved. We say burnout instead of depravity. We say productivity theater instead of the dogma of work. But the core existential struggle is identical.
We are trying to reclaim our time, our active energy, and our fundamental humanity from a system that views us primarily as instruments of production.
So as a listener, it fundamentally forces you to audit your own beliefs about productivity. Are you working for your own well-being, to support your family, and to contribute genuinely to your community?
Or are you trapped by a historical moral prejudice, that kind of duty we talked about?
It is about recognizing the difference between the essential work that sustains human life and the performative work that merely sustains an outdated, exploitative system of control. Once you see that distinction clearly, you can never unsee it. It changes how you value every single hour of your day.
So, to recap the journey we've been on today, we looked at Russell's argument that work is a tool of the privileged. We saw the evidence that technology can free us, starting from the wartime production of World War I.
We discussed the difference between active otium and passive exhaustion.
And how these 1935 ideas are the absolute bedrock of today's workplace burnout conversations. We have established that the technological barrier is gone. From the industrial machines that Russell observed in 1935 to the staggering capabilities of artificial intelligence and automation today, the mechanical possibility of a minimal labor, high-leisure society is more real than ever before. We could implement a 4-hour workday tomorrow, and society would not starve.
It's mechanically possible.
So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something for you to mull over on your own that pushes beyond just what Russell observed. If all our modern technology is finally making Russell's vision mechanically possible, and if the math supports it, what is the psychological barrier that still stops us from embracing a 4-hour workday? Are we more afraid of economic collapse, or are we simply terrified of finding out who we really are when we finally have the time to just be?